großartiges geleistet haben.
To address the issue of public remembrance, contested memories and learning history. Germany may serve as a possible role model for dealing with the burdens of the past in such a way that democracy and human rights can be fostered. I was asked to give you some insights into the ways and manners in which the German society has tried and is still trying to come to terms with the darkest chapters of its national history. Against this background, the role and possible contribution of Holocaust education to historical learning shall be examined in greater detail. Normally, you should see the you can see the structure of my talk here. Historical remembrance stands against forgetfulness and the danger of neglecting that state authorities in both other of our countries have exercised extreme violence against alleged enemies, be it, for example, the May 18 democratic movement in South Korea, be it Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, gypsies, and other supposedly hostile groups deliberately slaughtered during World War II. Although war, violence, and negative memories can be regarded as common denominators of remembrance in both of our countries, a comparative approach will therefore be chosen to elaborate on similarities and differences between Korea and Germany, including the question what is remembered and how this is done. Come to my second point here, learning from the past in Germany. In Germany, it took decades to agree on some key principles of history education, especially vis-à-vis the Nazi past. First, history and historical consciousness. History is not present in a current society as a fixed set of dates, names, and events, but as the result of interpreting the past. Obviously, these interpretations must rely on historical sources and data. However, obeying the rules of historical methodology alone does not build historical consciousness, the major category of historical learning in Germany. Human beings look back into the past and make their own sense of it. Both teachers and students of history must take close connections between present and past into account. For example, the Gwangju uprising is called Korea's Tiananmen, a collection of eyewitness accounts published in the year 2000 in the United States. President Kim Dae-jung, Nobel Prize laureate of this very same year, contributed a foreword to this volume, thus characterizing the perception of the Gwangju massacre as a precursor of Chinese atrocities against protesters. From the German perspective, this note is particularly interesting because the massacre in Tiananmen Square received broad attention in my country because of the events in the communist-ruled German Democratic Republic. The state leader Erich Honecker himself had closely followed the events in China. He and other radicals considered a Chinese solution of the problem of citizens' protest in the German Democratic Republic. In the end, however, the ruling SED refrained from such a solution. The events culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall could therefore be coined as a peaceful revolution. The Tiananmen massacre is part of both the Korean and German historical consciousness, however in quite different ways. These differences can be explained by the political circumstances. They challenged interpretations of the past in order to understand the present. Second point, history and narrative. Historical consciousness makes itself feel in the individual ability to tell history as a story. In other words, in the ability to build true individual and collective narratives. These narratives interpret and evaluate strains between past and present. Without such strains between the layers of time, history had to limit itself to the reproduction of factual accounts. Democracy cannot do without the freedom of individuals and social groups to identify their own position in the course of time by telling stories. Obviously, this freedom brings further strains between individual narratives and the legitimate need of any society to pass on certain values and interpretations of history to future generations, especially through the school system. In Germany, public denial of the Holocaust is a criminal offense. Teachers must not accept political opinions in class that are directed against the principles of democracy and human rights. This is easier said than done. The fight against the denial of crimes against humanity is a lesson from our history. Third point, history and the other. The idea that history becomes a tool of human orientation only when the past is remembered in the form of narrative resembles post-modern challenges of the preconception that history consists of structures and processes leading to modernity, in other words, of progress. Notwithstanding these post-modern roots, historical learning cannot refrain from the regulative idea of the one history of humankind. Knowledge of different cultural traditions and the recognition of the otherness is an indispensable prerequisite of global history. This issue becomes particularly relevant in an immigrant society like Germany, where a variety of cultural traditions, religious beliefs, and collective narratives are present in the classrooms. Doing global history in the framework of a dominant national history education, however, remains an unsolved problem in our society. Korean history, for example, is completely absent in German curricular textbooks, although both countries share important similarities. Historical consciousness is reliant on the ability of students to criticize society and take over responsibility for a better future. If this is the case, and if, as said before, the narrative competence of students should be fostered, history education will look for students' opportunities to build narratives on their own. This principle is highly disputed in the current German discourse over history and historical learning, not least because teachers must refrain from telling their own stories without letting students know about the underlying assumptions and intentions of their narratives. Fourth point, the politics of history. A second common denominator of Germany and South Korea has come to the fore during the 90s, which is since the end of the Cold War. Education agencies, NGOs, and intergovernmental organizations like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance have strongly emphasized the global meaning of crimes against humanity for future generations. Thus, the Holocaust and, for example, the Gwangju massacre are not only viewed as particular historical events, but also as cautionary historical examples for the threats against democracy and human rights. Come to my third point, Germany and South Korea entangled histories. Had Germany under Adolf Hitler not waged war against the victorious allies of the World War I in order to take revenge for the German defeat of 1918, Korean history would probably have followed different pathways. The Japanese attack on the United States, which triggered the expansion of the hitherto European war to a world war by the German dictator, resulted in the Japanese defeat and thus in the decolonization of Korea after more than 3 decades under Japanese rule. The Korean War was the first proxy war under the bipolar world order that had followed Germany's unconditional surrender. Unlike Germany, Korea had not been a theater of World War II. The Korean War hit the country and its citizens all the harder. Civilian losses of the Korean War by far surpassed those of the military involved, and they were significantly higher in percentage than the civilian losses of Germany during World War II. No research has been done about the perception of the Gwangju uprising by German political leaders and public. Although the television correspondent Jürgen Hinspeter and his team informed the German public about what was going on, the events remained more or less unnoticed. The West German peace movement against the introduction of American nuclear missiles reached its peak in 1980. Students and workers could have been intellectual allies of the peace movement. Demonstrators in my country did not refer to the massacre carried out here. You can see a poster of the federal election of 1953, which is deeply rooted in the Cold War and also in anti-communist sentiments of the ruling conservative Christian Democratic Union. And this notion was, of course, reinforced by the Korean War. But let us come back to the situation in 1979, 1980. I think that the different status of the national question in Korea and Western Germany constituted further reception barriers. Nationalism had been deeply devaluated by the catastrophic outcome of Nazi politics. By contrast, the rich cultural heritage of Korea had been delivered to oblivion during the Japanese rule. The same goes for Korean forced labor in Japan during World War II and the fate of Korean so-called comfort women who had been abused by the Japanese military. Korea, in short, had good reason to refer to its national history and heritage after 1945, similar to other countries during the decolonization process. Remembrance was, and possibly still is, directed against the oppression of Korea's national history under colonial rule and during the Cold War of the 50s and 60s. In Germany, influential intellectuals like the historian Hans-Ulrich Wehler, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and the sociologist Ralf Dahrendorf paid less attention to the national question. They wanted to strengthen Western German democracy, whereas the unification of Germany seemed to be far away during the 1980s. The political opinion of these intellectuals rooted deeply in the experience of Nazi dictatorship. Many German intellectuals accepted the division of Germany as a just retribution for the Holocaust, although it was in fact the result of the Cold War. Only after 1990, when the national question returned to the political agenda in terms of contemporary history, this notion of Auschwitz has been criticized as a questionable political exploitation of the Holocaust. South Korean attempts to ease relations with the communist North resembled the change through rapprochement, it was mentioned before in my country. Unless the German detente towards Eastern Europe, the Korean Sunshine policy has been aiming at the peaceful reunification of the two Korean states. This policy was supported by leftist groups who tried to demonize North Korean communism. Denial of the Gwangju massacre by a number of right-wing political groups and parties of the Republic of Korea is therefore based on the allegation that the events of 1980 had been secretly provoked by those Korean spies. The alleged destructive role of communist conspiracy has been a well-known pattern of German conservatism as well, as as shown before. But the political constellation within the Federal Republic differed considerably from that of the divided Korea, the last and only remnant of the Cold War. Now, my fourth point, contemporary history. My point of departure is contemporary history in the Federal Republic. In a famous article, the historian Hans Rothfels, 1953, defined contemporary history as, I quote, the epoch of those who are living through it and scholarly research of that period, quote, and especially since 1917. Because contemporary history had been institutionalized by the US occupying power in order to win the German population over to democracy, this discipline dealt with the destruction of the Weimar Republic in the initial years of its existence. From the late 60s through the 80s, the newly established social history underlined the crucial role of the 19th century as a prerequisite of Hitler's rise to power. The German Kaiserreich had in this view suffered from a lack of democracy that led to an authoritarian German special path to modernity, Sonderweg in German. At the same time, during the 60s and 70s, contemporary history went through a process of methodological innovation. Up to then, historians and political scientists had interpreted the Third Reich as a form of totalitarian rule. This notion was now challenged by younger historians who underlined both the chaotic character of Nazi rule and the role of the German elites that had brought Hitler to power. First point under this header number 4, remembering Nazi crimes. Nazi crimes, however, did not play a major role in this debate over the structure of the Third Reich. The Holocaust and other Nazi crimes against humanity had been unlimited in principle. The chain of events was characterized by countless massacres as well as the employment of modern technical means of killing like poison gas. Poland and the Soviet Union were the most important scenes of these crimes, and these countries also paid the heaviest price in blood during the war. In comparison, the Gwangju massacre was an attempt of the Korean military dictatorship to oppress the quest for democracy and further on even the memory of the victims of this policy. Massacres can be coined as especially gruesome outbursts of violence limited in space and time, as was the case in Gwangju in May 1918. Both events, Nazi mass crimes and the Gwangju massacre, were deeply disturbing, but the scope and the range of the Holocaust differed very much from the Gwangju events. In Germany, Poland and the Soviet Union were out of sight because of the Cold War. Public remembrance was more or less limited to the German victims of Hitler, especially the resistance movement of July 1944. The Federal Republic tried to draw historical legitimacy from the existence of an other Germany during the Nazi era, stating that Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators had been martyrs of democracy. Only after fierce debate over this issue, historians came to acknowledge that the conservative resistance movement from the military and the higher echelons of German bureaucracy had indeed not pursued democratic goals. The discussion opened up new ways of research about the German resistance movement. Besides this, the former Nazi concentration camps became major places of self-identification in both German states during the 50s. The German Democratic Republic, the communist German state, opened up a huge memorial in Buchenwald. The Federal Republic did so in Dachau. This is a picture of the memorial of Dachau with the Christian symbolic, and this is, of course, the famous Buchenwald memorial near Weimar. Both memorials mirrored a heroic perspective onto the victims of these camps. The GDR relied on the communist resistance fighters, the Federal Republic relied on victims from the Christian churches. Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and gypsies were more or less excluded from public memory during this period. It seems to me that the Gwangju May 18th National Cemetery in Gwangju for the victims of the democratic uprising is inspired by a heroic artistic language, not unlike that of Dachau and Buchenwald. The Democratic Republic of Korea remembers the victims as martyrs of democracy who go down in history forever. Obviously, the sacrification of the victims indicates a change in historical consciousness and remembrance practices. The judicial treatment of Nazi crimes by German prosecutors had a major impact on the way historians and the West German public dealt with the terrible legacy of the Third Reich. At the same time, contemporary history was challenged with the task to do research on and evaluate the history of the German Democratic Republic. This task was even more important because of the necessity to integrate the GDR memorials dedicated to the victims of fascism into the memorial landscape of the Federal Republic. One part of the scholarly community called the GDR as the, quote, second German dictatorship, thus highlighting parallels between the political system of the Eastern German state and the Nazi system. Others would focus on the task of coming to terms with contested memories of the victims of Nazism and communism. This debate is still alive in German society. Overall, contemporary history has been and prevails to be a mirror of public remembrance in Germany. Forgetfulness prevailed during the 50s, not least because the Cold War influenced and sometimes dominated the discourse over the scholarly community. Generational shifts appear to have been an indispensable prerequisite of the painful process of coming to terms with the recent past. The 70s saw the development of a new kind of historical consciousness. Remembrance stood against intentionally forgetting about the recent past. Historical consciousness, thus, was a critical consciousness. At the same time, it can be coined a negative memory of the victims and perpetrators. I do think that the evolvement of this historical consciousness was a major contribution of both contemporary history and forces of the German civil society to the democratization of the Federal Republic. Historical learning, in other words, is not limited to the classroom. Now I come back to my points. To history education. Since the 60s, also an increasing significance of contemporary history can be observed. The Nazi era plays a major role in history lessons of the 9th to 10th grades and again on the high school levels. This is of course a result of both the underlying processes of learning from a catastrophic history and the evolvement of a critical historical consciousness during the 1970s. It should be mentioned that school teaching in Germany is organized and regulated by the 16 federal states. There is no central authority for educational issues like in the Republic of Korea. However, the Ministers of Education had quite early agreed on the establishment of a coordinating body, the Kultusministerkonferenz. Its major task is to ensure the nationwide comparability of school and university diplomas. Besides that, the Standing Conference of the Ministers of Education intervenes into the contents and methods of history lessons. School syllabi reflect not only, and sometimes quite little, the findings of historical research, but also political intentions. Specialists in the field, like historians and didacticians, are seldom included into the setting of new courses for history education. The publication of new history syllabi has therefore triggered in most of the cases fierce political debates over history education in Germany. Let me insert a brief comparison with the situation in Korea here. Scholars have observed a war over history in Korea that has been going on for decades. It has reached its peak only recently with the debate about a new right history textbooks for Korean high schools. You all know what I'm talking about. The views presented in this book obviously mirror the standpoint of the current administration, or in the meantime not the current administration, vis-à-vis Korean contemporary history. I don't know how the Gwangju massacre is portrayed in the disputed textbook, but I can well imagine that legends about the alleged communist instigation of this uprising are once again reproduced, thus neglecting the memory of the events. The Korean case exemplifies the overarching political importance of contested memories in a society that strives to come to terms with the burdens of its past, even more so the crucial importance of democracy as a prerequisite of historical consciousness. Thus, the result of the war over history in the Republic of Korea may be interpreted as a good signal. However, there is also reason to believe that this war will continue in the future.
Darf ich bitten, 3 Minuten der Fairness halber.
Ja, ich habe es so übersetzt bekommen. I switch to number 5, Holocaust education, universalization of memory. I have argued in the preceding sections of my paper that contemporary history as well as history education can be regarded as fields of public historical remembrance in Germany. The reason for that is that history is not limited to the classroom. There has been a constant interaction between academic research and school teaching in the Federal Republic. However, this interaction hasn't been smooth at all phases considered. Regarding the Holocaust textbooks and history, lessons lag behind the historical research, sometimes for 2 decades or more. The result of recent Holocaust studies are only reluctantly integrated into the textbook narratives. German history students are used to tell a short story of this crime in class. In a strange way, historical remembrance in the public sphere has taken the lead for about 2 decades since the German reunification, leaving behind both the historical sciences and history education in schools. Museums, memorials, and other places where history is present in the current society are major attractions for tourists and visitors, as you can see in Berlin, for example. Media coverage of the Nazi past is widespread and thus most likely influence the historical consciousness of the German society. Through this process, the term remembrance has lost its critical impetus. Instead of scrutinizing the past, feelings and attitudes of the present dominate the approach to history. History is accepted if it makes you feel good. History is rejected if it makes the individual feel concerned. Remembrance means participating in a society that professes itself to remembrance, unless in a metaphorical and innocuous way. Against this background, I share the unease of many colleagues in the field with the inflationary use of remembrance as the alleged key to historical consciousness in Germany. This goes also with the concept of Holocaust education that had come to the fore since the last 10 or 15 years in Germany. The reason for the recommendation to apply questions and methods of Holocaust education are multifold. However, I cannot elaborate on that now because time is getting short. Some concluding remarks. The Gwangju uprising has been a catastrophic event in the contemporary history of Korea. It is imperative to save the memory of this event because it shows how citizens' movements fight for democracy under authoritarian rule. Courage and self-determination are the main features of the protesters in their day-long fight against the paratroopers of General Shandu. In terms of human rights, the most important legacy of the uprising lies in the contradiction between the rhetoric and politics of human rights, especially in the United States, and its realistic violation with the consent of the Carter administration. History education in school is in many ways linked to the historical consciousness of society. Germany is a striking example for the fact that the difficult task of coming to terms with the burdens of the past changes principles and methods of history teaching in the whole system. The most innovative decades have been the 70s as well as the 80s of the 20th century, at least from my point of view. As long as the Cold War forced educational reform to legitimize itself in terms of politics, a critical perception of the Western German society was highly probable. Let me conclude my lecture with a suggestion regarding the entangled histories of Germany and Korea. The Gwangju uprising and its reception from 1980 to the present is a topic that seems quite suitable for history lessons in German schools. Democracy is taken for granted by many of the German young people. Here we have the case of a citizens' movement that fought and died for democracy. At the same time, this example shows how hard the fight for remembrance can be. Historical consciousness is not a quiet conscience on the cheap. Thank you very much.
한국의 햇볕 정책이 이렇게 북한을 포용하는 정책이다라고 적극적으로 평가를 해주셨습니다만 햇볕 정책이란 말 자체가 이솝우화에서 유래한 거거든요. 그 이솝우화의 어떤 장면이냐면 햇볕을 통해서 상대방의 옷을 이렇게 벗게 만드는 그 이솝우화의 장면입니다. 그 얘기가 담고 있는 것은 사실 뭐냐면 햇볕 정책을 입안했던 중요한 사람 중에 하나가 김대중 대통령과 함께 일을 했던 임동원이라는 분인데 그 임동원 선생님이 그 자기 회고록에서 뭐라고 얘기를 하고 있냐면 신약성경에 나오는 로마서를 인용하면서 북한을 악으로 묘사하고 있습니다. 그리고 한국은 선이다라고 얘기를 하면서 악을 악으로 대하지 말고 선으로 대하라라는 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 그러니까 제가 이 말씀을 드리는 이유는 한번 여쭤보고 싶어서 그러는데 그러니까 브란트의 동방정책이 그 시작이 됐고 그 정권 교체가 있었음에도 불구하고 지속되었을 때 과연 그 서독에서는 동독을 무엇이라고 생각했었는지를 여쭤보고 싶었습니다. 그러니까 동독이 원래 악인데 전략적으로 악을 악으로 대하지 않기 위한 동방정책이었는지 아니면 그렇게 생각하지 않았는지.
Würde ich jedenfalls für meine Person sagen, dass wir die DDR nicht als satanisch betrachtet haben, sondern eher als entsetzlich langweilig, diktatorisch, spießig, so könnte man vielleicht sagen. Also als ein Staat, der ziemlich viele unangenehme Seiten der deutschen nationalen Tradition verkörperte, obgleich er auf der anderen Seite von vielen auch als eine Hoffnung angesehen wurde, weil es ein sozialistischer Staat war. Dieser Mann war ich persönlich nicht und der Mann war auch Willy Brandt nicht, sondern die Idee war, dass man durch kleine Schritte versucht, die Herrschaft der SED zu destabilisieren. Ich glaube, darauf lief es hinaus. Wann durch Annäherung war, wie einer der DDR-Offiziellen erkannt hat, eine Aggression auf Filzpantoffeln. Und genau das, meine ich, war es und hat auch tatsächlich entsprechende Wirkungen gezeitigt.
Nochmal bitten, ein bisschen auf diese Kategorie einzugehen, die mir immer ein bisschen suspekt zu sein scheint, weil die so unheimlich normativ aufgeladen ist. Weil aus meiner Perspektive da immer auch der Versuch hintersteht, ein reifes Geschichtsbewusstsein, ein richtiges Geschichtsbewusstsein von dem irgendwie vulgären, banalen Geschichtsbewusstsein zu unterscheiden. Deshalb würde ich gerne wissen, wie Sie sozusagen mit Blick auf die Kategorie Geschichtsbewusstsein, auf die Debatte gucken, was ist eigentlich das Verhältnis zwischen Geschichte und Erinnerung? Da, wo es ja auch eine lange Tradition gibt, da ganz klare Grenzmauern zu ziehen, was, glaube ich, in einer postmodernen, globalisierten Gegenwart enorm schwierig ist. Ich will das ganz kurz an dem Beispiel versuchen zu skizzieren, dass Sie selber auch in die Debatte eingeführt haben, weil Sie sich darüber gewundert haben, warum ist eigentlich das Kwangju-Massaker nicht Gegenstand im deutschen Geschichtsunterricht. Wer will eigentlich heute von welchem Standpunkt aus bestimmen, welche Themen im Geschichtsunterricht relevant sind oder nicht? Man kann sich auch darüber im Kopf machen, ob es nicht unendlich wichtig wäre, über den Genozid an den Armeniern zu sprechen, weil wir so viele Kinder mit Türkisch als zweiter oder erster Sprache in den Klassen sitzen haben. Will heißen, es ist doch unendlich schwierig geworden, zu bestimmen, was relevant ist und nicht relevant ist. Und damit wird aus meiner Perspektive diese ganze Trennung zwischen Geschichte und Erinnerung hinfällig. Es würde mich interessieren, wie Sie als jemand, der mit der Kategorie Geschichtsbewusstsein arbeitet, dazu stehen.
Ja, in der Tat stehe ich ziemlich stark auf den Schultern von Rüsen, weil ich sein Assistent war und auch diese ganze Entwicklung sehr hautnah mitbekommen habe. Also der Begriff Geschichtsbewusstsein ist in der Weise normativ, als er auf Vernunftgebrauch abstellt. Da würde ich Ihnen recht geben. Nun ist der Vernunftgebrauch an sich nicht Schlechtes, sondern sogar hoch wünschenswert. Und es geht darum, Geschichtsbewusstsein in einer Weise wachsen zu lassen, würde ich vielleicht formulieren, dass demokratische Werthaltungen in das eigene Selbstverständnis und auch in das Selbstverständnis der Gesellschaft substanziell mit aufgenommen werden können. Das scheint mir das normative Ziel dahinter zu sein. Man kann sagen oder könnte sagen, das sei vielleicht eine zu starke Zuspitzung auf politische Bedürfnisse, aber das ist die Konstellation, unter der der Begriff entstanden ist in den späten 1970er Jahren. Und da hat er auch nach wie vor seine Berechtigung, wie ich glaube. Sie haben recht, glaube ich, in Hinsicht auf den Punkt, dass wir gegenwärtig in einer Situation uns befinden, in der die Gegenwart sich sozusagen immer weiter ausdehnt und die Vergangenheit, der Andersartigkeit der Vergangenheit eine immer geringere Rolle für das öffentliche Bewusstsein spielt. Das nehme ich mit einer gewissen Besorgnis wahr. Der Kollege Sabo hier aus Berlin hat vor kurzem mal darauf hingewiesen, wir befinden uns offenbar auf dem Rückweg in eine Struktur der Geschichte als Lehrmeisterin des Lebens, Historia Vitae Magistra, wo die Vergangenheit nur sozusagen als Belegmaterial für gegenwärtige geschichtspolitische Auffassungen herangezogen wird. Das scheint mir eine problematische Tendenz zu sein und was Sie berichtet haben, würde sich hier vielleicht hineinfügen. Die Relevanzfrage möchte ich vielleicht so beantworten, es ist keineswegs beliebig, was sozusagen gelehrt wird. Eine Gesellschaft, das gilt für alle Gesellschaften weltweit, hat erst einmal den Anspruch, ihre jeweiligen nationalen Traditionen und kulturelle Errungenschaften an die nächste Generation weiterzugeben. Das ist nicht illegitim. Traditionsbildung gehört zum Geschichtsbewusstsein dazu. Aber, jetzt kommt sozusagen der entscheidende Punkt, die Frage ist doch, auf welche Kategorien soll das Geschichtsbewusstsein denn hinauslaufen? Wenn wir versuchen, irgendeine Form von Universalisierung noch als gültig zu betrachten, das scheint angesichts der globalen Geschichte unentbehrlich zu sein, brauchen wir Kategorien, die über das postmoderne sozusagen Prinzip des Anything Goes hinausgehen. Das ist meine persönliche Auffassung, ich weiß, dass die umstritten ist. Aber so weit würde ich schon gehen, zu sagen, dass wir also eine Kategorie der Menschheit brauchen. Und danach bestimmen sich dann Ziele. Man kann natürlich alles, was wir im Curriculum stehen haben, nur als exemplarische Fälle nehmen. Aber Korea beispielsweise ist doch für den Vergleichsfall eines geteilten Landes, das immer noch unter den Folgen des Kalten Krieges leidet, hochinteressant für deutsche Schülerinnen und Schüler. Von daher würde ich sagen, hier kann man das Prinzip sozusagen des Vergleichs und des Gegenwartsbezugs in einer Weise einüben, wie das bisher eigentlich nicht gemacht worden ist. Könnte man mal lange darüber diskutieren.
Okay, vielen Dank.
발표 감사합니다. 광주에서 이 발표를 똑같이 하셨다고 들었는데 스크립트가 거의 유사한 것 같아서 같은 강연을 하셨을 거라고 짐작을 합니다. 근데 궁금한 점은 이 발표를 들었을 때 광주에서의 그 청중들이나 그 사람들의 반응이나 의견이 어땠는지 좀 궁금합니다. 왜냐면 저는 개인적으로 오늘 발표를 들었을 때 조금 의문이 있었는데요. 저는 독일이 이렇게 historical consciousness를 가지는 것 자체에 대해서 높이 가치를 높게 생각하고 있고요. 그리고 홀로코스트 역사에 대해서 교과서에서 그리고 또 소풍을 통해서 끊임없이 후대에게 기억할 수 있게끔 한다는 그런 교육 자체에 대해서는 되게 배울 점이 많다고 생각을 합니다. 근데 그것을 광주랑 비교를 할 때 맥락적으로 좀 다른 면이 있지 않나 좀 궁금했습니다. 학생으로서. 왜냐면 홀로코스트 같은 경우에는 이제 구동독이 했었던 일이고 그 다음에 이제 서독과 구동독이 했었던 일은 아니잖아요. 어쨌든 통일 이후에 서독에 많은 분들이 교과서를 집필을 했다고 어제 수업을 들었는데요. 그렇기 때문에 더 이 홀로코스트에 대한 역사가 기록이 될 수 있었던 게 아닌가. 근데 광주 민주화운동 같은 경우에는 어떤 북한의 한 일이 아니라 사실은 한국 정부에서 국가적 폭력을 행사한 거라서 더더욱 지금 이 상황에서는 교과서에서 기록된다는 게 그렇게 노력하시는 학자분들이 되게 많음에도 불구하고 어렵지 않나 좀 궁금했습니다. 그 다음에 그래서 역사에서는 가정을 하면 안 된다고 하지만 조심스럽게 가정을 해본다면 만약 구동독의 역사학자들이나 다른 학자분들이 교과서를 집필하는 데 주도를 하셨다면 그래서 홀로코스트가 이렇게 교과서나 여러 교육 측면에서 기록이 될 수 있었을까 좀 궁금했고 두 번째 질문은 이거 홀로코스트랑 매우 다른 얘기인데요. 제가 얼마 전에 독일 역사관에 가서 독일의 식민지 역사에 대한 특별전을 봤어요. 근데 굉장히 흥미로웠고 이 전시가 저는 흥미로웠던 더 큰 이유는 저의 옆에 계신 많은 제가 아는 분들께서 독일에서 교육을 받았을 때 역사책에서 단 한 번도 식민지 역사에 대해서 제대로 배운 적이 없다고 했기 때문입니다. 단 한 줄만 나왔을 뿐이고 그것조차도 독일이 식민지 사업을 주도적으로 했다는 게 아니라 독일은 좀 착해서 이런 식민지 대열에 늦게 합류를 했다. 다른 국가들이 더 많이 식민지 사업을 했다라고 한 줄 적혀 있다고 제가 들었어요. 그래서 이거는 크리스토퍼 박사님께도 여쭤보고 싶은데 앞으로 그럼 독일 역사 교육 관점에서 이런 식민지 역사를 홀로코스트만큼 적나라하게
Ja, das sind sehr spannende Fragen. Vielen Dank. Also, ich habe versucht zum Ausdruck zu bringen, dass nach meinem Dafürhalten die Übernahme von Konzepten der Holocaust Education für das historische Lernen in der Republik Korea problematisch ist. Erstmal, weil die Vergleichsfälle, wie Sie ganz richtig gesagt haben, nicht vergleichbar sind, jedenfalls auf einer etwas genaueren Ebene, wenn man von grundsätzlichen her geht, ist jedes Opfer eines zu viel, aber sobald man versucht, es historisch, analytisch zu nehmen, kommt man sehr schnell an Grenzen der Vergleichbarkeit, das habe ich auch gesagt. Es gibt aber deutliche Tendenzen, gerade in Südkorea und gerade auch etwa im Umfeld der Stiftung 18. Mai, Holocaust Education als ein Paradigma für historisches Lernen generell heranzuziehen. Und das funktioniert sehr stark auf der Ebene der Emotionalisierung und der Emotionen, die geweckt werden sollen. Und ob das der richtige Zugang dazu ist, das wage ich doch immerhin zu bezweifeln. Deshalb würde ich sagen, etwas weniger Emotion, etwas weniger Emotionalisierung und dann auch etwas weniger Verflachung der politischen Botschaft, die von den Massenverbrechern an den Juden ausgeht. Was die zweite Frage angeht, die Geschichtsschulbücher, sie wären, also deutsche Geschichtsschulbücher sind keineswegs über alle Zweifel erhaben. Es gibt auch da einige Schwächen, die man nach wie vor anmerken kann. Wir haben hier den Professor Pingel im Publikum, der darüber sehr genau Bescheid weiß, auch aus langjähriger Forschungserfahrung. Aber ich glaube, dass jedenfalls eine multiperspektivische Darstellung eher der Fall gewesen wäre, wenn deutsche Schulbuchexperten und Didaktiker hinzugezogen worden wären. Und das ist ja auch ein Prozess, der in verschiedenen Projekten zwischen der Republik Korea und der Bundesrepublik durchgeführt wird. Ich denke hier an das Georg-Eckert-Institut in Braunschweig, das da einen starken Anteil dran hat. Ja, der Punkt Kolonialgeschichte, in der Tat hat es keine Rolle gespielt. Es gibt sozusagen das Modell des guten Bismarck gegen den bösen Hitler und dass unter Bismarck auch ein Kolonialreich, wenn auch kurzfristig begründet worden ist, hat man gerne vergessen. Das hat sich aber in letzter Zeit sehr stark geändert und es gibt jetzt eine ziemlich lebhafte Diskussion um die Frage, ob der Massenmord deutscher Kolonialschutztruppen an den Herero in Südwestafrika ein Genozid gewesen sei und damit der erste Genozid in der deutschen Geschichte vor dem Holocaust und vor allem, wie diese beiden Massenverbrechen miteinander in Verbindung stehen, wird intensiv geführt und ein Teil der Problematik, die in der Ausstellung zu sehen ist, ist ja genau dieses. Ja, haben wir es hier mit einem ersten Genozid zu tun. Ich glaube nicht, dass wir darauf hinkommen werden, den Holocaust durch den Hinweis auf den ersten Genozid in Südwestafrika zu relativieren. Aber die Kontextualisierung ist eine andere. Und natürlich geht der Blick jetzt stärker auf das 19. Jahrhundert wieder zurück. Das ist der normale Verlauf historischer Auseinandersetzungen.